The morning fog clung to the hills of San Mateo County like a gray shroud, the kind that made everything seem distant and muffled, as if the world itself was holding its breath. It was October 14th, 1983, and 16-year-old Mai Chen walked through the halls of Hillcrest High School, carrying her worn canvas backpack and a thermos of jasmine tea her mother had prepared before dawn. She moved with the quiet grace of someone who had learned to navigate spaces where she didn't quite belong, her dark hair catching the fluorescent light as she passed beneath it. If this story stirs something familiar in your heart, perhaps a memory of feeling like an outsider, or someone you once knew who simply disappeared from your life, share it with someone who might understand. Some silences carry more weight than words ever could. Mai had been in America for 3 years, her family among the wave of Vietnamese refugees who had found their way to California's suburbs, seeking safety in a country that promised second chances. Her father worked double shifts at an electronics manufacturing plant. Her mother cleaned houses in the wealthy neighborhoods across town, and Mai excelled in her studies with the fierce determination of someone who understood that education was the bridge between her parents' sacrifices and her own future. That Thursday morning, she attended her usual classes, advanced chemistry, where she sat in the front row taking meticulous notes in her neat handwriting, American literature, where she raised her hand to discuss The Great Gatsby with insights that surprised her teacher, and calculus, where she helped tutor classmates who struggled with concepts that came naturally to her brilliant mind. Her teachers would later remember her as polite, hard-working, never causing trouble, the kind of student who made their job worthwhile. At lunch, Mai sat at her usual table near the windows overlooking the courtyard, eating the banh mi her mother had packed, reading a library book about marine biology. She dreamed of studying oceanography at UC San Diego, of exploring the mysteries beneath the waves that reminded her of the South China Sea her family had crossed to reach this new life. A few classmates nodded at her as they passed, but conversations were brief, surface-level exchanges about homework or upcoming tests. The autumn air carried the scent of eucalyptus and dying leaves as students moved between classes. Mai's locker was number 247, tucked in the sophomore hallway between a water fountain that barely worked and a bulletin board covered with college recruitment flyers. She had decorated the inside with a small mirror, a photo of her family taken at Ocean Beach, and a calendar where she marked test dates and project deadlines in red ink. After school, she was supposed to walk to the public library, where she worked part-time shelving books and helping elderly patrons find large-print novels. The head librarian, Mrs. Rodriguez, had grown fond of Mai's quiet reliability and her gentle way with children during story time. Mai never missed a shift, never arrived late, never left without ensuring every returned book found its proper place on the shelves. But Mai Chen never made it to the library that day. The last confirmed sighting placed her at her locker around 3:15 p.m., approximately 10 minutes after the final bell. A janitor named Frank Kowalski later told police he remembered seeing an Asian girl with a blue backpack walking toward the side exit that led to the student parking lot, but he couldn't be certain it was Mai. The security cameras that might have captured her final moments had been broken for weeks, waiting for repair funds that never seemed to materialize in the school district's tight budget. Her parents waited until nearly midnight before calling the police, hoping she had simply lost track of time at the library or perhaps gone to study at a classmate's house without calling home. But Mai was not the kind of daughter who forgot to check in. She understood the weight of worry, the way fear could settle into immigrant parents, hearts like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples of anxiety that touched everything. The initial police report classified Mai Chen as a runaway, despite her parents' insistence that their daughter would never leave voluntarily. Detective Robert Hayes, a 20-year veteran of the San Mateo County Sheriff's Office, conducted interviews with teachers, classmates, and family friends. Everyone described Mai the same way: responsible, focused, devoted to her family, excited about her future. Not the profile of someone who would simply walk away from everything she had worked so hard to build. Search parties combed the hills behind the school, volunteers checked every bus station and youth shelter within a 100-mile radius, and missing person flyers with Mai's senior portrait went up on telephone poles throughout the county. The local Vietnamese community organized prayer vigils and distributed flyers in both English and Vietnamese, hoping someone might have seen something, remembered some small detail that could bring their daughter home. As days turned to weeks, the case grew cold. Detective Hayes retired 3 years later. The file transferred to a younger officer, who inherited dozens of unsolved cases and limited resources to pursue aging leads. Mai's parents never stopped hoping, never stopped waiting for a phone call or knock on the door that might explain what happened to their daughter. They moved to a smaller apartment but kept Mai's room exactly as she had left it, her textbooks still stacked on her desk, her dreams of studying the ocean still written in the margins of her notebook. The years passed like water over stones, wearing away the sharp edges of immediate grief, but never fully erasing the questions that haunted those who remembered Mai Chen. Hillcrest High School graduated class after class. Students who had never heard her name or known her quiet presence in the hallways where she once walked with purpose and hope. 30 years moved through California like shifting seasons, bringing changes that transformed the landscape of memory itself. The suburbs of San Mateo County sprawled outward, strip malls replacing orchards, tech companies building gleaming campuses where dairy farms once dotted the rolling hills. The Vietnamese community that had welcomed Mai's family grew and prospered, establishing businesses, sending children to universities, weaving their stories into the larger tapestry of American dreams realized through perseverance and sacrifice. But Hillcrest High School stood frozen in time, a monument to fiscal neglect and shifting demographics. Enrollment had been declining since the early 2000s, as families moved to newer developments served by schools with better funding and modern facilities. The once proud institution, which had educated generations of middle-class families, began showing signs of institutional decay that mirrored the economic changes sweeping through traditional American communities. The building's concrete facade, modern when it was constructed in 1967, now appeared dated and worn. Windows that once gleamed with possibility were cracked or boarded over, the result of vandalism and deferred maintenance. The parking lot, where Mai had last been seen 30 years earlier, sprouted weeds through cracks in the asphalt, and the chain-link fence surrounding the property sagged under the weight of ivy and neglect. David Park stood in that parking lot on a gray February morning in 2013, his breath visible in the cold air as he surveyed the building he would soon help demolish. At 45, he was the kind of contractor who took pride in careful work, whether he was building something new or taking something old apart. His construction company had won the bid to prepare Hillcrest High for demolition, clearing out decades of accumulated materials before the wrecking ball arrived to make way for a mixed-use development of condominiums and retail space. David had grown up just 20 miles away, the son of Korean immigrants who had arrived in California in the 1970s, with hopes similar to those carried by Mai's family. He understood the weight of expectations placed on children of immigrants, the way success was measured not just in personal achievement, but in justification of parents, sacrifices. His own high school experience had been marked by the careful navigation between cultures, the constant awareness of being different in spaces where difference was not always celebrated. The irony was not lost on him that he was dismantling a school where someone like him, someone like Mai, had once sought education as a pathway to belonging. But progress demanded change, and change often required the erasure of what came before. His crew began their methodical work on a Monday morning, starting with the removal of everything that might have value or require special disposal. Asbestos tiles, old computers, laboratory chemicals, furniture that might find new life in other schools or nonprofit organizations. The work was dusty, methodical, tinged with melancholy as they moved through classrooms where thousands of students had once learned algebra, read Shakespeare, conducted chemistry experiments, dreamed about futures that seemed limitless. The hallways echoed with the sounds of their work, dollies rolling over worn linoleum, the crash of desks being loaded into dumpsters, the occasional discovery of items that spoke to vanished lives. In one classroom, they found a box of essays from 1995, students writing about their hopes for the new millennium. In another, a time capsule sealed by the class of 1988, never opened because the ceremony had been canceled due to budget cuts. Maria Santos, the school's last custodian before it closed, met David at the building each morning to unlock doors and provide access to areas that had been sealed for years. She had worked at Hillcrest for 15 years, watching enrollment dwindle, programs disappear, hope gradually drain from the faces of teachers who had once believed in the transformative power of education. "There are stories in every corner of this place," Maria told David as they walked through the main corridor, her keys jangling against her hip. Kids who made it out, kids who didn't, teachers who changed lives, moments that mattered to someone. It's sad to see it all come down, but maybe that's how things are supposed to be. Nothing lasts forever. She showed him which areas needed special attention, which rooms might contain hazardous materials, which sections of the building had been closed to students even before the school's final closure. The basement storage area. The old bomb shelter, built during the Cold War. The second-floor wing that had been damaged by an earthquake in 1989 and never fully repaired. And the locker bay, where some of the units had been painted shut, their contents preserved like artifacts from an archaeological dig. "We stopped assigning those lockers around 1995, Maria explained, pointing to a section near the sophomore hallway. Something about the combination locks being broken, but honestly, we just didn't have enough students to need all the space. Principal Martinez had them sealed rather than deal with maintenance requests." David nodded, making notes on his clipboard. He had seen similar situations in other old schools, areas that became forgotten, spaces where time stopped moving forward while the world changed around them. His job was to clear everything out, but he approached the work with respect for what these places had meant to the people who had passed through them. The fog rolled in from the Pacific that afternoon, wrapping around the building like a shroud, muffling the sounds of traffic from the nearby freeway. David's crew worked steadily through classrooms and offices, but as evening approached, they hadn't yet reached the sealed locker section. That work would wait for tomorrow, when they would need special tools to remove the layers of paint that had essentially cemented the doors shut. As David locked up the building and walked to his truck, he thought about the weight of erasure, how places could disappear from the landscape while their ghosts lingered in memory. Somewhere out there, former students of Hillcrest were living their adult lives, probably never thinking about their old school unless they drove past it on the way to somewhere else. Most of them would never know it was being torn down, never have the chance to walk through those halls one more time and remember who they had been when the future seemed both terrifying and full of infinite possibility. But some places hold on to their secrets longer than others. Some stories wait decades to be told. The morning David Park's crew began work on the sealed lockers, the fog had lifted early, leaving behind a crisp clarity that made every detail of the abandoned school seem sharper, more defined. February sunlight streamed through dusty windows, illuminating particles that danced in the air like memories refusing to settle. The hallway where they worked felt different from the rest of the building, quieter somehow, as if time had pooled here like water in a forgotten basin. Worker Jose Martinez operated the reciprocating saw that would cut through the layers of institutional paint sealing each locker door. The high-pitched whine of the blade echoed off the empty walls, a sound that seemed to disturb the settled silence of decades. David supervised the process, checking each door as it was opened, making inventory of contents that would need to be disposed of according to county regulations. The first dozen lockers revealed the expected detritus of abandoned student life. Moldy textbooks with pages warped by moisture, rusted metal rulers, pencil cases filled with dried-out pens, notebooks where teenage handwriting had faded to ghostly impressions. A few lockers contained clothing, Letterman jackets with names embroidered on the chest, sneakers that had once been white, sweaters that still held traces of long-forgotten perfume or cologne. Each item told a small story of interrupted routine, of students who had simply walked away at the end of a school year and never returned to collect belongings that had once seemed important enough to secure behind combination locks. David found himself handling these artifacts with unexpected reverence, as if he were an archaeologist uncovering evidence of a lost civilization rather than a contractor clearing out junk. Locker 247 sat near the end of the row, its green paint faded to a dull olive that had merged with multiple layers of institutional repainting over the years. When Jose S. saw finally cut through the accumulated paint, the door swung open with a metallic groan that seemed to carry more weight than physics alone could explain. The contents were immediately different from what they had found in other lockers. A small mirror hung on the inside of the door, still reflecting light after 30 years of darkness. Below it, a photograph had been taped to the metal surface, a family portrait showing an Asian couple with 2 children, standing on a beach with the Golden Gate Bridge visible in the background. The image had the slightly overexposed quality of early 1980s photography, the colors saturated in the particular way of film developed at drugstore photo labs. David lifted the photograph carefully, noting how the tape had yellowed but still held. The family looked happy, hopeful, dressed in their best clothes for what was clearly a special occasion. The teenage girl in the photo wore a blue sweater and had her hair styled in the layered look popular during the early 1980s. Her smile was gentle, reserved, the expression of someone who was comfortable behind the camera but not entirely at ease being the center of attention. Below the photo, a calendar was still attached to the locker door, October 1983. Several dates had been marked in red ink. Chem test. History paper due. Library shift 4 to 8. The handwriting was neat, precise, the penmanship of someone who took care with details. On the locker's top shelf sat a thermos, dented but still intact, alongside a small stack of books. Marine Biology, An Introduction by Harold Barnes. Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. The Joy Luck Club by Amy Tan, though the book looked new, as if it had been purchased but not yet read. A spiral notebook lay beneath the books, its pages filled with the same careful handwriting they had seen on the calendar. David opened the notebook, finding chemistry equations, English literature notes, and in the margins, small drawings of sea creatures, jellyfish, seahorses, coral formations, rendered with the detailed accuracy of someone who had studied them closely. On one page, a paragraph had been written in what appeared to be Vietnamese, the characters flowing across the page like water. But it was the item on the bottom shelf that made David's breath catch in his throat. A manila envelope, thick with contents, had been wedged behind a pair of sneakers. Someone's name was written on the front in block letters, M.A.I. Chen. Below that, in smaller handwriting, "If something happens to me, please make sure someone sees this." David's hands trembled slightly as he lifted the envelope. The weight of it suggested photographs, documents, something substantial enough to matter. Through the translucent envelope, he could make out what appeared to be additional photographs and folded papers. "Hey, boss," Jose called from down the hallway, where he was working on another row of lockers. "You okay over there? You look like you've seen a ghost." David didn't answer immediately. He was thinking about missing person cases, about families who never got answers, about the particular weight of secrets that had been waiting 3 decades to be discovered. The name Mai Chen didn't mean anything to him personally, but the careful way she had hidden this envelope, the deliberate nature of her note, suggested someone who had been afraid of something specific. "I'm fine." David finally called back. "Just found something interesting." He gathered all the items from locker 247, placing them carefully in a cardboard box he retrieved from his truck. The family photograph, the thermos, the textbooks, the notebook filled with dreams of studying marine biology, and the envelope that felt like it might contain answers to questions someone had been asking for 30 years. That evening, David sat in his home office with the box of Mai Chen's belongings spread across his desk. He had called the San Mateo County Sheriff's Office, speaking with a detective who took down the information, but seemed skeptical that a discovery in an abandoned school locker would yield anything useful for a case that was 30 years old. "Look, Mr. Park," Detective Lisa Chen had said, and David noted the irony of the shared surname. "We get calls about old evidence all the time. Construction workers find things, people clean out relatives, houses, metal detector enthusiasts dig up items in parks. Most of the time, it's just old stuff that doesn't connect to anything. But I'll look up the case file and see if there's anything worth pursuing." But David couldn't shake the feeling that Mai Chen had been trying to tell someone something important. The way she had carefully preserved these items, the note on the envelope, the sense that she had been preparing for a possibility she hoped would never come to pass. It all suggested someone who had been afraid, someone who had felt the need to leave evidence behind. He opened his laptop and searched for Mai Chen Missing California 1983, finding a few brief newspaper articles from the time. The coverage was minimal, the kind of perfunctory reporting given to cases that police had initially classified as runaways. A 16-year-old honor student from a Vietnamese immigrant family had disappeared after school on October 14, 1983. No body had ever been found, no suspects identified, no resolution reached. But the articles mentioned that Mai had been last seen near her locker, gathering her belongings at the end of the school day. Locker 247. The same locker where she had hidden an envelope with instructions that suggested she had been expecting trouble. The envelope lay unopened on David Park's kitchen table for 2 days, while he wrestled with questions that seemed to multiply rather than resolve themselves. Was he interfering with an official investigation by examining potential evidence? Did he have a moral obligation to respect the privacy of someone who had been gone for 30 years? Or was there something more immediate at stake? The possibility that Mai Chen had left behind information that could finally provide answers to questions that had haunted her family for 3 decades. On Thursday evening, with rain drumming against his windows, and the television news playing stories about current tragedies that would become tomorrow's unsolved mysteries, David made his decision. He opened the envelope with the careful precision he brought to his construction work, using a letter opener to avoid tearing anything that might be important. The contents spilled across his table like puzzle pieces from a picture he couldn't yet see complete. Photographs. At least a dozen of them, all in the square format of instant cameras popular in the 1980s. The images were clearer than he had expected, protected by the envelope and the sealed locker from the humidity and temperature changes that had degraded so many other items in the abandoned school. The first photograph showed a car, a dark-colored sedan parked outside what appeared to be Mai's family home. The image had been taken from an upstairs window, looking down at the street. Someone had written on the white border, "September 15th, following me home again." The next several photographs documented similar surveillance. The same car parked near the school, visible in the background of what should have been innocent snapshots of campus life. Mai had been methodical in her documentation, noting dates and times in her neat handwriting. September 20th, September 28th, October 5th. Always the same dark sedan, always positioned where its occupant could observe without being easily seen. But it was the photographs of the letters that made David's blood run cold. Mai had photographed what appeared to be notes that had been left in her locker, on her car windshield, slipped under her family's front door. The handwriting was crude, angry, filled with racial slurs that David found difficult to read even 30 years later. "Go back where you came from. America for Americans. We know where you live." The language was violent, specific, designed to intimidate and terrorize. One note was different from the others, more threatening in its precision. "Smart girls who don't know their place sometimes disappear. Ask around. It happens more than you think. October 15th would be a good day for you to go back to Vietnam." October 15th, the day after Mai had vanished. David found himself pacing his kitchen, the implications of what he had discovered settling into his consciousness like stones dropped into still water. This wasn't a runaway case or a random tragedy. This was evidence of harassment, of threats, of someone who had been systematically terrorizing a teenage girl in the months leading up to her disappearance. The final items in the envelope were even more specific. Mai had somehow obtained photographs of the car's license plate, though the images were slightly blurred as if taken quickly from a distance. She had also included a handwritten list of dates and locations where she had encountered the harassment, noting patterns that suggested her tormentor had knowledge of her daily routine. And at the bottom of the envelope, folded small enough to fit in the corner, was a note written in Mai's careful handwriting. "I think someone is going to hurt me. I've tried to tell my parents, but they don't want to believe that people here could hate us just for being different. They came to America to be safe, and I don't want to take that feeling away from them. But I'm scared. If something happens to me, I hope someone will look at this and know that I didn't just run away. I love my family. I love school. I want to study the ocean and maybe help people understand that we're all connected by water, that boundaries are just lines on maps. I hope whoever finds this will help my parents understand that I would never choose to leave them. My name is Mai Chen, and I was here." David sat down heavily at his kitchen table, the weight of 30-year-old fear settling around him like fog. This wasn't just evidence of a crime. It was a testament to a young woman's courage, her determination to leave behind proof of what had been done to her, even as she tried to protect her family from the painful truth that their adopted country still harbored dangers they had fled Vietnam to escape. He thought about Detective Lisa Chen's skepticism, about how easy it would be for this evidence to disappear into a filing cabinet or be dismissed as too old to pursue. He thought about Mai's family, and whether they were still alive, still waiting for answers that might finally be within reach. But mostly he thought about the terrible precision of that final threat. October 15th would be a good day for her to go back to Vietnam. Whoever had written those words had known exactly when they planned to act. The fact that Mai had disappeared on October 14th suggested either remarkable coincidence or that she had been taken a day earlier than her tormentor had intended. David picked up his phone and dialed the sheriff's office again, this time asking specifically for Detective Lisa Chen. When she answered, he could hear the skepticism in her voice begin to dissolve as he described what he had found. "Mr. Park," she said after a long pause, "I'm going to need you to bring all of that evidence down to the station tomorrow morning. And I'm going to need you to handle those materials as little as possible from now on. What you found This changes everything about how we look at Mai Chen's disappearance. Detective Chen, David said, there's something else. The last threatening note mentioned October 15th specifically. Mai disappeared on October 14th. Whoever wrote this was planning something for the next day. Another pause. Longer this time. We'll see you first thing tomorrow morning, Mr. Park, and thank you. After 30 years, Mai Chen finally has someone speaking for her again. That night, David couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the courage it must have taken for a 16-year-old girl to document her own harassment, to prepare evidence for a crime that hadn't yet been committed, to leave behind a message for people she hoped would care enough to seek the truth. Mai Chen had been afraid, but she hadn't been passive. Even in her terror, she had been trying to protect others. Her family from painful knowledge, future investigators from unsolved questions, her own memory from the assumption that she had simply chosen to disappear. The rain continued falling against David's windows, washing the February darkness with a sound like tears that had waited 30 years to finally fall. Detective Lisa Chen arrived at the San Mateo County Sheriff's Office at dawn on Friday morning, 2 hours before her normal shift, carrying a cardboard box that contained the original case file for Mai Chen's disappearance. The file was thinner than it should have been, 17 pages documenting 30 years of unanswered questions, failed leads, and the gradual transition from active investigation to cold case storage. She had spent the previous evening reading through reports written by Detective Robert Hayes, the original investigating officer who had since passed away. Hayes had been thorough within the constraints of his time and resources, but the case had been hampered from the beginning by assumptions that now seemed tragically misguided. The initial classification as a runaway had shaped every subsequent decision, from the allocation of investigative resources to the level of media attention the case received. When David Park arrived at 8 a.m. carrying the box of evidence from locker 247, Detective Chen met him in the lobby rather than making him wait. She had been thinking all night about the coincidence of their shared surname, about the ways identity could shape both opportunity and vulnerability in America, about how different Mai Chen's case might have been received if she had been a blonde teenager from a wealthy family rather than a Vietnamese immigrant's daughter. Mr. Park, she said, shaking his hand, I want you to know that what you've found has the potential to completely change this investigation. But I also want you to understand that cases this old present unique challenges. Witnesses may have died or moved away, physical evidence may have degraded, and memories fade in ways that can make prosecution difficult even when we know what happened. David nodded, following her through the secured doors to the detective division. I understand. But Mai's family deserves to know the truth, don't they? Even if justice is no longer possible, they should know she didn't choose to leave them. They spread the contents of the envelope across Detective Chen's desk, each item tagged and photographed, before being sealed in evidence bags. The photographs of harassment, the threatening notes, the documentation of surveillance, together they painted a picture of systematic intimidation that had escalated toward violence. This changes the entire timeline, Detective Chen said, studying the dates Mai had recorded. The original investigation focused on the day she disappeared, but this shows months of buildup. Someone was stalking her, threatening her, planning something specific. The license plate numbers in Mai's photographs were partially visible in several images. Detective Chen ran them through databases that hadn't existed in 1983, finding that one of the plates had been registered to a 1979 Buick LeSabre, owned by someone named Thomas William Morrison, aged 34 at the time of Mai's disappearance. Morrison had lived less than 3 miles from Hillcrest High School. Morrison, Detective Chen said, typing the name into her computer. Let's see what we can find. The records painted a troubling picture. Thomas Morrison had been arrested twice in 1982 for disturbing the peace at anti-immigration rallies. In 1984, 11 months after Mai's disappearance, he had been convicted of assault after attacking a Korean War veteran at a Veterans Day ceremony, claiming the man wasn't a real American. He had served 18 months in county jail and then apparently left California. He fits the profile, Detective Chen said. White male, history of racial violence, living in the area when Mai disappeared. And look at this. He worked as a maintenance contractor for the school district from 1981 to 1983. He would have had access to school buildings, knowledge of student schedules, familiarity with the campus layout. David felt a chill of recognition. A maintenance contractor. He could have gotten into the school after hours, could have known which lockers weren't being monitored, could have planted those threatening notes without being noticed. Detective Chen was already making phone calls, checking databases, following investigative trails that should have been pursued 30 years earlier. Within 2 hours, she had located Morrison's current address, a trailer park outside Bakersfield, California, where he was living on disability payments and had been arrested twice in the past decade for drunk and disorderly conduct. "He's still alive," she told David, 64 years old, still in California, "and Mr. Park, there's something else." Morrison was questioned briefly during the original investigation. His name came up because he worked for the school district, but Detective Hayes didn't have access to the evidence he found. Morrison told police he didn't know Mai Chen, said he'd never spoken to any of the Asian students. But Mai's evidence proves he was stalking her. Exactly. Which means he lied to police during a missing persons investigation. That's obstruction of justice, and there's no statute of limitations on that charge. Detective Chen began organizing a more comprehensive investigation, reaching out to federal authorities who specialize in civil rights crimes, consulting with prosecutors about the possibility of charges, even after 3 decades. The case was no longer just about a missing person. It was about hate crimes, about the systematic intimidation of a young woman whose only crime had been excelling in school while being different from her classmates. But the most difficult call was the one Detective Chen knew she had to make to Mai's family. She found them through immigration records and community organizations that had helped Vietnamese refugees settle in California during the 1980s. Mai's parents, now in their 70s, still lived in the same apartment where they had waited for their daughter to come home 30 years earlier. Her younger brother had become a doctor, married, moved to San Jose, but visited his parents every Sunday for dinner. They prepared at a table that still included a place setting for Mai. When Detective Chen called and identified herself, the silence on the other end of the line lasted so long she wondered if the connection had been lost. "You have found something about Mai?" Mrs. Chen finally asked, her English still accented by decades of speaking Vietnamese at home. "Yes, ma'am. We have found evidence that suggests Mai didn't run away. We believe someone may have hurt her because she was Vietnamese, because she was different. I know this is painful to hear, but I think you deserve to know that your daughter never chose to leave you." The sound that came through the phone was not quite crying, not quite relief, but something deeper, the exhalation of breath that had been held for 30 years. "We always knew," Mrs. Chen said. "Mai would never leave us. She was good daughter. She loved family. She loved school. Someone hurt her. We always knew." Detective Chen found herself wiping tears from her own eyes as she promised Mrs. Chen that they would finally seek justice for Mai, that her daughter's voice would finally be heard after 3 decades of silence. "Mai was a smart girl," Mrs. Chen said. "If she left evidence, she wants someone to find it. She wants truth to come out." Thank you for listening to my daughter. Thomas William Morrison lived in a single-wide trailer at the end of a dusty road in Bakersfield, surrounded by discarded auto parts and the kind of accumulated debris that spoke to decades of disappointment and declining prospects. When Detective Lisa Chen and FBI Special Agent Maria Rodriguez knocked on his door on a Tuesday morning in March, they found a man who seemed surprised that anyone from his past was still paying attention to choices he had made 30 years earlier. Morrison was 64 years old, his hair gone gray and thin, his face marked by lines that suggested years of outdoor work and too much alcohol. He answered the door wearing a stained undershirt and work pants, squinting against sunlight that seemed to hurt his eyes. The trailer behind him smelled of cigarettes and old food, the windows covered with blankets that blocked most of the natural light. "Thomas Morrison?" Detective Chen asked, showing her badge. "Depends on what you want," Morrison replied, his voice carrying the hoarse quality of a long-time smoker. "I ain't done nothing recently that would interest the police. We'd like to ask you some questions about Mai Chen." The change in Morrison's expression was immediate and unmistakable. His face went pale beneath the weathered skin, his hand tightening on the doorframe as if he needed physical support. The name had hit him like a physical blow, awakening memories he had clearly hoped were buried deep enough to never resurface. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but the lie was transparent, written in the sudden tension of his shoulders and the way his eyes darted away from their faces. "Mr. Morrison," Special Agent Rodriguez said, "we have evidence that suggests you were stalking a 16-year-old girl in 1983. We have photographs of your car, copies of threatening notes you left for her, documentation that shows you planned to harm her. We're not here to play games." Morrison stood in his doorway for a long moment, seemingly frozen between competing impulses to run or fight or simply collapse under the weight of secrets he had carried for 3 decades. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. She was just supposed to get scared and leave town. That's all it was supposed to be. The confession came easier than either investigator had expected, as if Morrison had been waiting 30 years for someone to ask him the right questions. They read him his rights there on his doorstep, but he waived his right to an attorney, seemingly eager to finally unburden himself of a story that had been poisoning his conscience for decades. Inside the trailer, Morrison told them about the fall of 1983, about his job maintaining school district buildings, about his growing resentment toward the Vietnamese families who had settled in his community. He had lost his previous job to what he claimed was reverse discrimination, had been passed over for promotions he felt he deserved, had watched property values in his neighborhood decline as more immigrant families moved in. I wasn't a bad person, Morrison said, though the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. I just wanted things to go back to how they used to be, when America was for Americans. You know, these people came here and took jobs, took opportunities that should have gone to people like me. Detective Chen bit back her response to Morrison's twisted logic, focusing instead on extracting information that might finally provide answers about Mai's fate. Tell us about October 14th, 1983, she said. Morrison's hands shook as he lit another cigarette, the flame from his lighter revealing fingers stained yellow by decades of nicotine. I was just going to scare her one more time. Make her understand that she needed to convince her family to leave. I waited by her locker. Figured I'd corner her when she was alone. Tell her that bad things happen to people who don't listen to warnings. But something went wrong, Special Agent Rodriguez prompted. She wasn't scared of me anymore. That was the problem. When I confronted her, she told me she had evidence. Said she had photos of my car, copies of the notes I'd left. Said she'd already given everything to someone safe, and if anything happened to her, the police would know exactly who was responsible. Morrison took a long drag from his cigarette, his hands trembling more noticeably now. I panicked. I grabbed her arm, tried to get her to tell me who she'd given the evidence to, where it was hidden. She fought back harder than I expected. She was small, but she was strong, and she was angry. The trailer filled with smoke and the weight of a confession that had been 30 years in the making. Detective Chen exchanged glances with Special Agent Rodriguez, both of them recognizing the moment when a cold case transforms into something that demands justice, even across the span of decades. What happened next, Mr. Morrison? Detective Chen asked. She fell. We were struggling, and she hit her head on the edge of her locker. Just went down like a stone. There was blood, and she wasn't moving, and I knew I was in trouble. Real trouble. Morrison's voice broke as he continued. I didn't mean for her to die. I just wanted her to be scared enough to leave. But there she was, and I could hear other kids coming down the hallway, and I knew if anyone found her there with me. So you moved her body, Special Agent Rodriguez said. Morrison nodded miserably. I had my work truck in the parking lot. I waited until the hallway was empty, then carried her out through the maintenance exit. Drove her up into the hills behind the school, to an old construction site where I'd been doing some work. There were foundations that had been dug but never finished, and He couldn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Both investigators understood what had happened to Mai Chen's body, where she had been hidden for 30 years, while her family waited for answers that had been buried under concrete and lies. The construction site, Detective Chen said. Where exactly? Morrison gave them directions to a location that had been developed years later into a residential subdivision. Houses now stood where Mai Chen had been buried, families living above a grave they never knew existed. I covered her up with concrete from the job site, Morrison said. Made it look like part of the foundation work. Nobody ever questioned it. The project got canceled a few months later, but by then it just looked like an old foundation that had been abandoned. The full horror of what Morrison was describing settled over the investigators like a weight that threatened to crush them. Mai Chen hadn't just been murdered. She had been erased, buried under the suburban development that represented the American dream her family had been seeking. Mr. Morrison, Detective Chen said, I need you to understand something. Mai Chen didn't give anyone that evidence. She hid it in her locker, where it stayed sealed for 30 years until a construction worker found it last month. She was trying to protect her family by not telling them about the threats, but she was also smart enough to leave proof of what you were doing to her. Morrison's face crumpled as the implications sank in. You mean she, All this time, the evidence was just sitting there? The evidence that's going to put you in prison for the rest of your life, Special Agent Rodriguez said. Murder, hate crimes, obstruction of justice. Mai Chen may be gone, but her voice is finally going to be heard. Morrison was arrested that afternoon, charged with second-degree murder and federal hate crime violations. The media coverage was immediate and extensive. The story of the Asian student who had vanished in 1983 and the racist killer who had evaded justice for 30 years captured national attention in a way that Mai's original disappearance never had. But for Detective Chen, the most important moment came 3 days later, when she sat in the living room of Mai's parents and told them that their daughter's body would finally be coming home. Mr. and Mrs. Chen listened in silence as Detective Chen explained what Morrison had confessed, how Mai had died, where she had been hidden all these years. When she finished, Mrs. Chen reached for her husband's hand, and they sat together for a long moment, processing news they had waited 3 decades to hear. Our Mai was brave, Mrs. Chen finally said. She was afraid, but she was brave. She left evidence so someone would know the truth. Yes, ma'am, Detective Chen replied. She was very brave, and very smart. Even when she was scared, she was trying to protect others. Can we bring her home now? Mr. Chen asked, his voice barely audible. We'll need to excavate the site where Morrison buried her, Detective Chen explained. It may take some time, but yes. Mai can finally come home. The excavation of 1247 Meadowbrook Drive began on a foggy April morning, the kind of weather that seemed appropriate for the solemn work of disturbing ground that had kept its secrets for 30 years. The house that sat above Mai Chen's grave was a modest 2-story colonial built in the late 1980s as part of a development that had transformed former farmland into suburban streets lined with young oak trees and automatic sprinkler systems. The current owners, the Rodriguez family, had been living in the house for 12 years, raising 2 children who had played in the backyard that unknowingly served as Mai's unmarked grave. When Detective Chen had arrived to explain the situation, their shock had been absolute, the kind of disbelief that comes when ordinary life collides with unimaginable tragedy. She's been here all this time? Maria Rodriguez had asked, standing in her kitchen while looking out at the yard where her daughter's swing set cast shadows across the grass. All these years we've been living above. The family had voluntarily relocated to a hotel while the excavation took place, understanding that their home would never feel the same regardless of what was found beneath their foundation. Some violations of sacred space can never be fully repaired, only acknowledged and somehow absorbed into the ongoing story of a place. David Park stood at the edge of the work zone, watching as forensic archaeologists and crime scene technicians carefully removed layers of soil and concrete. He had requested permission to observe the excavation, feeling a responsibility to witness this final chapter of a story that had begun when he opened Locker 247. The construction worker who had found Mai's evidence felt obligated to see her recovery through to its conclusion. The work proceeded with archaeological precision, each layer of earth photographed and cataloged before being removed. Thomas Morrison's confession had provided general directions, but 30 years of development had altered the landscape enough that locating the exact burial site required careful investigation. Ground-penetrating radar had identified anomalies beneath the foundation of the Rodriguez home, areas where the soil density suggested disturbance that predated the house's construction. Dr. Sarah Kim, the forensic anthropologist leading the excavation, worked with the methodical patience of someone accustomed to coaxing stories from reluctant ground. She had recovered remains from mass graves in Bosnia, identified victims of natural disasters, helped families find closure in cases where loved ones had vanished without explanation. But there was something particularly poignant about Mai Chen's case, the way a brilliant young woman's dreams had been quite literally buried under the suburban prosperity she had hoped to achieve through education and hard work. We're finding what appears to be clothing fabric, Dr. Kim announced on the second day of excavation, her voice carrying across the work site with clinical precision. Synthetic material, consistent with 1980s manufacturing. And there are personal effects, what looks like jewelry, possibly a watch. Mai's parents had driven down from San Mateo County to be present for the excavation, though they remained in their car at the edge of the property, unable to come closer but unwilling to be absent when their daughter was finally found. They had waited 30 years for this moment, and Detective Chen understood their need to be witnesses to Mai's homecoming, even if the circumstances were more heartbreaking than any closure they had dared to imagine. Dr. Kim worked with brush and trowel, revealing fragments of a life that had been ended too soon. A class ring from Hillcrest High School. A watch with a cracked face that had stopped at 3:47, frozen at the moment impact, had shattered both timepiece and the future it had been meant to measure. Pieces of clothing that had been blue, the color Mai had been wearing when she disappeared. And then, carefully exposed in the soil like an artifact from an archaeological dig, Dr. Kim found Mai's backpack. The canvas had deteriorated over the decades, but the contents were partially preserved. Textbooks that had turned to pulp, pens that had long since stopped writing, and a thermos, the same thermos David had found in her locker, suggesting Mai had kept a matching set, one for school and one for her after-school job at the library. "We have confirmation," Dr. Kim said quietly, looking up from the excavation site. "Based on the personal effects and the physical evidence, this is almost certainly Mai Chen." The words carried across the worksite like a benediction, bringing an end to 3 decades of questions while simultaneously opening new wounds that might never fully heal. Mai Chen had been found, but she would never come home in the way her parents had dreamed during all those years of hoping she might walk through their door with an explanation for where she had been. Detective Chen walked to the car where Mai's parents waited, approaching with the careful respect due to people who were about to receive the most difficult gift imaginable, final knowledge of their daughter's fate. "Mr. and Mrs. Chen," she said softly, "we found Mai. We'll need to complete additional testing to make the identification official, but we're confident that we've recovered your daughter's remains." Mrs. Chen made a sound that was part grief and part relief, a vocalization of emotions too complex for words. Her husband reached for her hand, and they sat together in the front seat of their car, holding each other while processing news they had simultaneously dreaded and prayed for. "Can we see her?" Mrs. Chen asked. Detective Chen glanced back at the excavation site, where Dr. Kim and her team were carefully documenting every detail of the recovery. "Not yet, ma'am. The forensic team needs to complete their work first. But I promise you'll be able to bring Mai home properly when we're finished." "She was so far from home," Mr. Chen said, his voice breaking. "All this time, she was so far from home." "But she left us a message," Detective Chen replied. "The evidence she hid in her locker. She made sure we would know the truth. Even when she was afraid, she was thinking about her family, about making sure you would have answers someday." The excavation continued for 3 more days, recovering not just Mai's remains but also physical evidence that corroborated Morrison's confession. Concrete samples matched the mixture used in the abandoned construction project. Soil analysis confirmed that the burial had occurred in late 1983. Every detail aligned with the story Morrison had told, removing any doubt about his guilt or Mai's fate. On the final day of the excavation, as Dr. Kim supervised the careful removal of the last evidence from the site, David Park found himself thinking about the strange mathematics of tragedy, how 30 years could collapse into a moment, how a life interrupted could still somehow speak across decades of silence. Mai Chen had been 16 years old when she died, full of dreams about studying marine biology and helping people understand the connections that bind all life together. She had never seen the ocean she had hoped to explore, never attended the university she had worked so hard to reach, never had the chance to prove that the future belonged to people brave enough to believe in it. But in her final weeks, faced with threats designed to make her feel powerless and unwelcome, Mai had found the courage to document her harassment and preserve evidence that would eventually bring her killer to justice. Her voice, silenced for 30 years, had finally found a way to speak. The ground had given up its secrets at last, and Mai Chen was going home. 6 months after Mai Chen's remains were recovered from beneath the suburban foundation, her funeral took place on a clear October morning at Crystal Springs Cemetery, where rolling hills overlooked the Pacific Ocean she had dreamed of studying. The Vietnamese community had organized a traditional ceremony that honored both her Buddhist heritage and the American identity she had been building when her life was cut short. David Park stood among the hundreds of mourners who had gathered to pay their respects, former classmates who had barely known Mai during her brief time at Hillcrest High, teachers who remembered her quiet brilliance, members of the Vietnamese community who understood that her murder had been an attack on all of them, and strangers who had followed her story in the media and felt compelled to witness this final chapter. The service was conducted in both Vietnamese and English, reflecting the dual nature of Mai's identity and the bridge she had been trying to build between her family's heritage and her American dreams. Her parents, now in their mid-70s, sat in the front row surrounded by relatives and community members who had supported them through 3 decades of uncertainty and 6 months of painful closure. Detective Lisa Chen delivered a eulogy that focused not on the manner of Mai's death, but on the courage she had shown in her final weeks, the way she had protected her family, while also preparing evidence that would eventually speak for her when she could no longer speak for herself. Mai Chen was 16 years old when she died, Detective Chen said, her voice carrying across the assembled mourners. But in those 16 years, she demonstrated more wisdom, more courage, and more determination than many people show in lifetimes twice as long. She understood that education was the pathway to opportunity, that hard work could overcome prejudice, that the future belonged to people brave enough to believe in it. Even when she was afraid, even when someone was trying to terrorize her into silence, Mai continued to go to school, continued to excel in her studies, continued to dream about exploring the mysteries of the ocean, and when she realized she might be in danger, she did something extraordinary. She documented the threats against her, preserved evidence that would eventually bring her killer to justice, and left behind a message that ensured her voice would finally be heard. The detective paused, looking out at the faces of people who had been touched by Mai's story. Mai Chen believed that we are all connected by water, that boundaries are just lines on maps. Today, as we lay her to rest overlooking the ocean she wanted to study, we remember that truth connects us all. Her legacy isn't just the evidence she left behind, but the reminder that courage can speak across decades, that justice may be delayed but need not be denied, and that every young person deserves the chance to chase their dreams without fear. Thomas Morrison had been sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, convicted on charges of second-degree murder and federal hate crimes. At 74 years old, he would die behind bars, his confession ensuring that Mai's family finally had both answers and justice. The case had prompted a review of other cold cases involving missing Asian Americans during the 1980s, leading to new investigations and renewed attention to crimes that had been inadequately investigated due to bias and indifference. But for Mai's family, the most meaningful moment came after the formal service, when they gathered at the graveside for a private ceremony that honored their daughter's memory in ways that felt both ancient and immediate. Mrs. Chen placed a lei made of jasmine flowers on the casket, the same flowers she had used to make tea for Mai's thermos every morning before school. Mr. Chen left a copy of Marine Biology and Introduction, the textbook their daughter had been studying when she died, along with a letter written in Vietnamese that he had never been able to give her. Mai's younger brother, now Dr. Michael Chen, spoke about the scholarship fund they were establishing in his sister's name, designed to help young Vietnamese Americans pursue careers in science and education. Mai believed that understanding the natural world could help people understand each other, he said. This scholarship will ensure that other young people have the opportunities she was denied, that her dreams continue in new voices and new discoveries. As the ceremony concluded and mourners began to leave, David Park approached Mai's parents to offer his final condolences. The connection he felt to this family was difficult to explain. He had never met their daughter, had discovered her evidence only by chance, yet somehow felt responsible for ensuring her story was told completely and with dignity. "Mr. and Mrs. Chen," he said, "I want you to know that finding Mai's evidence was the most important work I've ever done. She was an extraordinary young woman, and I'm honored to have played a part in bringing her home." Mrs. Chen took his hands in hers, her grip surprisingly strong for someone who had endured such long grief. "You listened to our daughter when no one else could hear her voice," she said. "You helped her speak across 30 years of silence. Our family will never forget." As David walked back to his truck, he thought about the strange journey that had begun with opening a sealed locker in an abandoned school. He had been hired to clear out decades of accumulated debris, to prepare a building for demolition that would make way for new development. Instead, he had uncovered a story that connected past and present, that transformed a missing person case into a testament to courage, that proved justice could survive even when it seemed impossible. The Pacific Ocean stretched out beyond the cemetery, its waves carrying the eternal rhythm that Mai had hoped to study and understand. She had believed that water connected all things, that boundaries were arbitrary divisions in a world where everything ultimately flowed together. Standing there in the October sunlight, listening to the distant sound of waves against the California coast, David understood that some connections transcend death itself. Mai Chen's voice had been silenced for 30 years, but it had never truly been lost. Hidden in a sealed locker, preserved in careful documentation, protected by the courage of a 16-year-old girl who refused to disappear without leaving evidence of her existence, her voice had waited patiently for someone to listen. The ocean keeps all secrets eventually, but sometimes it gives them back. 3 months later, David Park received a letter from the University of California at San Diego, informing him that the first recipient of the Mai Chen Memorial Scholarship was a young Vietnamese-American woman named Lisa Nguyen, who planned to study marine biology and oceanography. The letter included a photograph of Lisa standing on a research vessel, holding equipment that would help her explore the mysteries beneath the waves that Mai had dreamed of understanding. In the photograph, Lisa was smiling with the quiet confidence of someone who understood that education was a bridge between one world and another, that knowledge could overcome prejudice, that the future belonged to people brave enough to believe in it. She looked, David thought, exactly like the kind of person Mai Chen would have become if she had been given the chance to grow up. The waves continued their eternal rhythm against the California coast, carrying stories forward through time, connecting all things in the endless circulation of water that recognizes no boundaries, acknowledges no divisions, remembers everything, and forgives nothing until justice is finally done. If stories like Mai's move you to believe in the power of hope and the strength of human connection, we share them because they remind us that even in our darkest moments, the melodies of love continue to play, waiting to guide us home. Subscribe to our YouTube channel to hear more stories that touch the soul and inspire the heart.